October 16, 1966, 11:15 a.m. Outside Abyssinian Baptist Church, 132 W 138th Street, the sound of the choir singing Amazing Grace was shattered by the roar of a sawed-off shotgun. It wasn't the rhythm of Harlem on a Sunday, it was the sound of a war declaration. On the sidewalk, amidst the Sunday hats and polished shoes, lay Jeremiah Junebug Rivers, Bumpy Johnson's most loyal lieutenant and head of security. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding his 5-year-old daughter, shielding her small body with his massive frame. Blood, bright and arterial, pooled on the concrete, staining the hem of his wife's white dress. The shooters, 4 young men in a stolen Pontiac, screeched away laughing. They hadn't just targeted a gangster, they had targeted a family leaving the house of God. Bumpy Johnson stood 10 feet away. He didn't flinch at the sound of the blast. He didn't run for cover. He walked calmly through the chaos of screaming parishioners to where his friend lay bleeding. Junebug looked up, his eyes losing focus, gripping Bumpy's hand with a strength born of desperation. "My baby," Junebug wheezed, blood bubbling past his lips. "Is she safe, June?" Bumpy said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated with terrifying finality. "She's safe." Bumpy stood up. He looked at the retreating taillights of the Pontiac. He checked his watch. It was 11:17 a.m. By 11:17 a.m. on Tuesday, everyone in that car would cease to exist. 3 weeks earlier, by 1966, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was in the twilight of his reign, but the sun hadn't set yet. Fresh from a decade-long stint in Alcatraz, released in 1963, Bumpy had returned to a Harlem that was changing. The civil rights movement was in full swing. Malcolm X had been assassinated the year prior, and the streets were angry. Bumpy, now in his late 50s, moved differently. He was less of a street brawler and more of an elder statesman, a gentleman gangster, who quoted history books and played chess in the back of the Lenox Lounge. He acted as a buffer. The Italian families downtown, specifically the Genovese crime family still, relied on Bumpy to keep the flow of numbers and heroin distribution smooth. Though Bumpy publicly denounced the poison destroying his community, he was a complex figure, a criminal who paid for scholarships, a killer who funded food drives. To the people of Harlem, he was the only authority that mattered because he was the only one who listened. But the new generation didn't care about history. Young, aggressive crews were popping up, fueled by the influx of heavy narcotics and a lack of respect for the old codes. They saw Bumpy as a relic. They mistook his silence for weakness and his patience for fear. They didn't understand that Bumpy Johnson was a man who had survived the toughest prison in America. They didn't know that when an old man survives in a profession where men die young, you should fear him more than God. The shooting of Junebug Rivers wasn't a business move. It was a violation of the most sacred rule of the underworld. You never touch the family. You never bring the war to the church steps. By breaking this seal, the young upstarts forced Bumpy to remind Harlem why he wore the crown. The architect of this brutality was a 24-year-old hustler named Alonzo "Silk" Patterson. Silk was the leader of the 142nd Street Kings, a crew of 7 violent, ambitious men who had grown up watching Bumpy from afar but had no respect for the hierarchy. Silk was charismatic but reckless, known for wearing flashy Italian suits he couldn't afford and driving cars bought with blood money. Silk wanted the crown. He believed Bumpy was hoarding the wealth of Harlem and acting as an Uncle Tom for the Italian mob. "The future belongs to the young," Silk had told the contact at the boom room a week prior. "Bumpy is playing chess, we're playing executioner." Silk was dangerous because he had no boundaries. In the last 6 months, his crew had robbed 3 protected policy banks and beaten an elder runner nearly to death for $50. They were unpredictable, high on their own supply, and heavily armed with military surplus weapons flooding the streets. The attack on Junebug was Silk's way of saying, "I can touch you anywhere." He chose Junebug because Junebug was Bumpy's right hand, his eyes and ears. Silk believed that if he crippled Bumpy's protection, the old man would retreat or sue for peace. He calculated that Bumpy, an ex-con on parole, wouldn't risk going back to prison for a violent retaliation. It was a fatal miscalculation. October 17th, 9 p.m. Harlem was holding its breath. The news of the church shooting had spread like wildfire. Everyone knew retaliation was coming, but the streets were eerily quiet. The Lenox Lounge was open, but the laughter was muted. Silk and his crew were holed up in a brownstone on 142nd Street, celebrating. They were drinking expensive scotch, convinced they had scored a blow against the Empire. They had guards posted on the stoop and the roof. They felt untouchable in their fortress. 9:30 p.m. The phone rang in the brownstone. Silk picked it up. "Mr. Patterson," a calm voice said. It was Bumpy. Silk laughed, signaling his boys to quiet down. "Old man, I thought you'd be hiding." "I have a proposition," Bumpy said. "To avoid a war that burns down the whole neighborhood, meet me, tonight. Small's Paradise, just you and me. We settle terms." Silk grinned. He thought Bumpy was surrendering. "Midnight, and I'm bringing my boys." "Bring who you want," Bumpy replied. "Just don't be late." 11:45 p.m., Small's Paradise, 2294 7th Avenue. The legendary club was dimly lit. The band was on break. Bumpy sat at a centered table, a bottle of champagne on ice, a single glass poured. He looked relaxed, reading a newspaper. 11:55 p.m., the doors swung open. Silk walked in, flanked by 4 of his toughest lieutenants. They were loud, arrogant, taking up space. They carried bulges under their jackets that they didn't bother to hide. "You look tired, Bumpy," Silk sneered, pulling out a chair without asking. "Time for retirement?" Bumpy folded his newspaper slowly. He placed his glasses on the table. "Retirement is for men who have finished their work, Alonzo. I'm still working." 11:58 p.m. Silk leaned forward. "Here's the deal. We take 135 to 145 to 145. We take the heroin distribution. You keep the numbers and the old ladies, and you pay us a tax for operating in our territory." Silk's men snickered. The disrespect was palpable. The air in the club smelled of stale smoke and cheap cologne. Bumpy looked at his watch. A silver Patek Philippe? He tapped the crystal face. "It's 11:59, Alonzo." "So what? I gave you 48 hours to leave town. You spent 36 of them celebrating. You have 1 minute left." Silk laughed, reaching for the champagne bottle. "Or what? You gonna hit me with your cane?" "No," Bumpy said softly. "I'm going to wait." 12 a.m. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed. Gong. Bumpy didn't move. Silk stopped laughing. "Where are your other 3 men, Alonzo?" Bumpy asked. "The ones you left at the brownstone? The ones guarding your stash?" Silk frowned. "How do you?" The phone behind the bar rang. It was a shrill, piercing sound in the quiet club. The bartender picked it up, listened for a second, and then placed the receiver on the bar, looking at Bumpy. He nodded once. What Silk didn't know was that Bumpy hadn't spent the last 36 hours mourning. He had spent them mobilizing a network that Silk couldn't even comprehend. The twist: Bumpy never intended to fight Silk at Small's Paradise. The meeting was a distraction. It was the bait to get Silk and his top enforcers out of their fortress. The preparation, while Silk was gloating, Bumpy had called in a favor from the Black Muslims, specifically a security detail affiliated with the Nation of Islam that operated with military precision. He also leveraged a connection with a corrupt detective in the 32nd Precinct to pull police patrols away from 142nd Street for exactly 1 hour. The execution, at exactly 11:58 p.m., while Silk was demanding territory, a team of Bumpy's most seasoned hitmen, who had served in Korea and World War II, breached the brownstone on 142nd Street. They didn't knock. They used silence. They moved room to room with suppressors. The 3 men Silk left behind were dead before they hit the floor, but the real move was happening right now, inside Small's Paradise. Bumpy looked at Silk. "Pick up the phone, Alonzo." Silk stood up, sweating now. He walked to the bar. He picked up the receiver. "Yeah?" Silence on the other end. Then the sound of a match being struck. Then the sound of Silk's own brother, who was supposed to be safe at the stash house, whimpering. "Silk?" His brother's voice cracked. "They're everywhere. There!" Click. Silk dropped the phone. He spun around, reaching for his gun. "Don't," Bumpy said. Bumpy reached into an ice bucket next to his table. He didn't pull out another bottle. He pulled out a damp, folded piece of paper. He tossed it onto the table. It was the deed to the brownstone on 142nd Street. "I own the mortgage, Alonzo. I bought it yesterday from the bank. You were trespassing." Bumpy stood up. "You shot a man in front of his child. You broke the code. Now the code breaks you." As if on cue, The kitchen doors of Small's Paradise swung open. The band entrance swung open. The front door locked. 12 men emerged from the shadows. They weren't young hustlers. These were hardened men in fedoras and trench coats, holding Thompson submachine guns and shotguns. The old guard had arrived. October 17th, 12:05 a.m. Silk Patterson looked at his 4 men. They were trembling. They realized they were boys playing a game against a grandmaster. There was nowhere to run. The exits were blocked by walls of lead. "Bumpy, wait," Silk stammered, raising his hands. "We can work this out. I'll pay. I'll leave." "You had 48 hours, Bumpy said, turning his back. "Time is a luxury you spent." Bumpy walked toward the exit. He didn't look back. As he pushed through the heavy double doors into the cool Harlem night, the sound erupted behind him. It wasn't a firefight. It was an execution. The roar of the Thompsons was muffled by the thick walls of the club, but the vibration could be felt in the soles of Bumpy's shoes. October 18th, 8th Inc. The police found the brownstone on 142nd Street empty. No bodies, no drugs, just the smell of bleach and fresh paint. At Small's Paradise, the cleaning crew arrived to find the floors scrubbed immaculate. The 142nd Street Kings simply vanished. There were no funerals, no obituaries. Rumors swirled that they had been taken to the marshes of New Jersey or fed to the incinerators of a Bronx tenement. They became ghosts, a bedtime story told to frighten young hustlers who thought about crossing the line. Junebug Rivers survived. He spent 3 months in the hospital. When he finally walked out, Bumpy was there waiting with a new car and a trust fund established for his daughter. The message rippled to the underworld like a shockwave. The Italians, the police, and the young crews all understood one thing: you can battle Bumpy for money, you can battle him for turf, but if you touch his family, you don't just die, you disappear. This event, known quietly in the streets as the 48-hour Purge, solidified Bumpy Johnson's status as a mythic figure in his final years. It demonstrated that, even without the physical agility of his youth, his strategic mind was a weapon of mass destruction. He dismantled an entire organization without firing a single shot himself. The story highlights the difference between a gangster and a boss. Silk Patterson was a gangster, loud, violent, and reactionary. Bumpy Johnson was a boss, patient, strategic, and absolute. He understood that violence shouldn't be random. It should be a surgical tool used to restore order. Universal lesson: respect the hierarchy and never mistake patience for weakness. There are lines you do not cross. When you attack a man's family, you strip him of the rules that keep him civilized. And a man without rules is the most dangerous thing on earth. If this story taught you the real meaning of loyalty, hit that subscribe button. Drop a like if you respect the old school code. Comment below, what would you have done in Bumpy's shoes? Next week, the secret meeting between Bumpy Johnson and Malcolm X.